They train for 2 years. They're the lords of the skies.
We're now take off.
Request climb flight level 360.
And our lives are in their hands. Pilots. But what happens if a pilot doesn't know what he's doing?
It turned like this and nosedived into the ground.
The aeroplane hits the surface of the sea, everybody dies.
Pilot error has been responsible for some of the worst accidents in aircraft history.
Unfortunately, he didn't handle this particular situation correctly.
The fight to reduce pilot error has become one of the big challenges of aviation. Tens of millions of pounds are being thrown at the problem.
Airbus's philosophy was, we can make an airplane that's pilot-proof.
But in a bid to eliminate pilot error, have we gone too far? Could it be some of these developments may have actually caused disasters? Qantas is the safest airline in the world. Famously, none of its big jets has ever crashed. But in autumn 2008, that reputation is suddenly on the line. Qantas Flight 72 is travelling from Singapore to Perth. It's an Airbus A330, one of the most modern aircraft in the world. At the controls, the flight crew are equipped with the latest technology designed to make flying safer. But as the aircraft, packed with over 300 holidaymakers, nears the Australian coast, it suddenly performs a series of bizarre and dangerous maneuvers. First, it climbs 200 feet. Then, equally suddenly, it drops 650.
What's the plane doing? What's the plane doing?
The pilots have no idea what's going on. The plane is acting entirely on its own. Then it happens again. Uncommanded by the pilots, the plane plunges another 400 feet. Minutes later, the horrified captain issues a Mayday distress call.
Mayday, 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 Qantas 72.
315 people's lives are on the line. Will the pilot be able to rescue the situation? Yet the irony is, the entire incident is due to a computer-controlled flying system designed to eliminate a common cause of air crashes: pilot error. Just how serious the problem of pilot error can be is brought home to the people of Britain in the winter of 1989. British Midland Flight 92 takes off on a routine flight to Belfast in Northern Ireland. The aircraft is one of Boeing's new 400 series 737s. In charge is 43-year-old Captain Kevin Hunt, one of British Midland's most experienced pilots. His first officer is 39-year-old David McClelland. It's a normal takeoff. But then, 13 minutes into the flight, just as the aircraft is about to hit cruising altitude, there's a shock. Passengers frantically look around for an explanation. Hunt and McClelland immediately suspect one of the plane's 2 engines has blown up. The cockpit voice recorder picks up Hunt urgently asking which of the 2 engines is damaged.
Which one? Which one?
His first reaction is to turn to the aircraft's instruments. But the instruments that will tell him if an engine is malfunctioning the so-called vibration instrumentation, is notoriously unreliable in 737s at the time. Pilots don't trust them. So when smoke appears in the cockpit, McClelland falls back on his general knowledge of the aircraft. This tells him the smoke must be coming through the air conditioning system, and this, in 737s, is powered by the right engine. The cockpit voice recorder now picks up McClelland making a clear decision.
It's the right one, it's definitely the right one.
Shutting down the right.
Hunt immediately shuts down the right-hand engine. The clunking and vibrations cease. Calm returns to the cabin. The passengers relax. But minutes later, there's another, even bigger bang. Once again, the plane is rocked by vibrations. Then everything goes eerily quiet. The second left-hand engine has died. Flight BM-92 has no power at all. Seconds later, the 400-ton aircraft smashes into the ground.
An airliner with 118 passengers on board has crashed on the M1 motorway in Leicestershire.
Initial signs suggest there won't be many survivors. Ed Trimble led the air crash investigation.
Mr. Trimble, BBC, can we talk to you? I'm sorry.
I think most investigators would have said that the chances of many surviving that would have been low. Clearly, the aircraft is flying at over 100 knots on the approach, and suddenly it's been brought to a halt very abruptly indeed, and therefore one would have anticipated the G-forces would have been really significant.
Amazingly, only 47 passengers die. 71 survive. Among them is the aircraft's captain, Kevin Hunt. At first, he's hailed as a hero for at least bringing some people down alive. But soon afterwards, questions start to be asked.
We were getting reports of ground witnesses who had seen and heard this aircraft on the approach. What we were being told was that the left engine was covered in fire. It was like looking into a furnace, someone said.
This fire in the left-hand engine would have been the first bang the passengers heard. But that shouldn't have been fatal. The twin-engined plane can fly quite safely on one engine.
Clearly, that hadn't happened. So the question was, what's happened to the right engine?
The right engine is minutely inspected. Slowly, an awful truth dawns.
The full strip inspection of the right engine revealed that there were no problems with the right engine prior to the impact.
It's the right one, it's definitely the right one.
Shutting down the right.
And yet this right-hand engine is the one the crew had shut down. So why had the pilot turned off his only working engine? The investigation will now reveal a classic case of pilot error. The pilots simply weren't familiar with their aircraft. Hunt and McClelland, not trusting their instruments, had relied on their general knowledge of 737s. This told them the smoke must be coming from the right engine, and so they'd shut it down. What they didn't know was that the new 400 series 737 is different from its predecessors. The aircon is powered by both engines. The smoke and smell came from the damaged left engine, not the perfectly good right one. David Learmount is a pilot and aircraft journalist.
Both pilots had the vibration information in front of their eyes, and it was accurate. It was showing them where the problem was. But because they were used to flying on the 737-300, where the vibration instruments were not reliable, they disregarded the instruments altogether.
The investigation has revealed an alarming truth. Neither pilot knew enough about the aircraft they were flying. The crash was caused by pilot error. Hunt, far from being a hero, is sacked. But behind the crash lies a much bigger issue that is increasing the chances of pilot error. A deluge of new aircraft models starts appearing from the 1980s onwards.
It was a period of great development, a great change in the industry.
Captain Chris Clark is an airline pilot and flight trainer.
Pilots were faced with a significant number of differing equipment, even on the same type of aircraft.
It's a situation almost designed to foster pilot error. Pilots are having increasing difficulty keeping up with the ever-changing models.
It could be a different set of flight instruments, or it could be a different flight management system computer.
Each new version is better and safer than its predecessor, or fills a particular niche in the competitive aircraft market. But Kegworth has dramatically shown the downside. Hunt and McClelland had had almost no training on the new Boeing 737-400 series.
The airline had assumed that because these people were experienced on the 737-300, that they really only needed what they referred to as a differences course to go onto the 400.
Kegworth is a clear warning. Pilots need more systematic retraining if there are not to be further cases of pilot error. Pilots now begin to spend more time in highly realistic, computer-controlled flight simulators. But despite the new training opportunities,
Tower from Midland 1, we've had an undercarriage collapse.
the airline industry doesn't fully learn the lessons from Kegworth. It's not just about having more training. The training has to be good, or there can be unexpected consequences, every bit as deadly. It will need another tragic accident for the industry to realize it must do even more. Autumn 2001, and an American Airlines flight takes off from New York's Kennedy Airport. Flight 587 is bound for the Dominican Republic. On board, many of the passengers are visiting family and friends. But almost immediately after takeoff, something goes wrong. Patrick Tuhig is a local Catholic priest.
I spotted this aircraft going over. I thought, looking back on it, that it was flying a bit low. It turned like this and nosedived into the ground. So then I said to myself, oh my God, this is very, very serious. And I remember thinking how beautiful that plane looked in the last seconds of its life, because the sun shining directly onto that aircraft before it hit the ground.
American 587 Heavy, I'm not receiving your transponder. American 587 Heavy, New York. American 587 Heavy, New York.
265 people die immediately, including 5 on the ground. Christine Negroni is a journalist who's written extensively about the aircraft industry.
It was a dramatic event because it was only 2 months after 9/11, and so there were immediate concerns and eyewitness accounts and everything else, you know, that the plane had been the victim of a terrorist attack.
It's one of the worst accidents in American aviation history.
If you saw the people in the immediate vicinity, they were stunned.
One of the victims is Jose Laura, a law student. His sister still finds it hard to talk about it.
It's really hard to live with this pain. I don't even want to see my brother picture because I don't want to think that he's not here with us no more.
The man in charge of the crash investigation is Bob Benson. He immediately faces demands for instant answers. This is a very public disaster in a very public place.
Well, there was a lot of pressure from the city of New York. The very first news conference we give, we always get the question, what happened here? What's the cause of this accident? And of course, we can never answer.
The hunt for answers is hampered by the sheer scale of the devastation. There is almost nothing left of the aircraft.
My initial thoughts are really about the magnitude of our job. A lot of times in these types of accidents, we get a lot of information out of the wreckage itself. But in this case, unfortunately, the fire was so complete, the aircraft was full of fuel when it hit the ground, that we had very few physical clues to look at.
But then they find one massive clue.
It had to do with the vertical stabilizer of the airplane that was floating in the bay over a mile away from the main impact point. It would be very strange if a terrorist simply blew the tail off of an airplane. And so we thought early on that we were probably up against something a little more complicated than a terrorist attack.
It is the case that the National Transportation Safety Board is the lead agency because all information we have currently is that this is an accident.
But if it is an accident, what caused it? Autumn 2001, and an American Airlines flight takes off from New York's Kennedy Airport. But almost immediately after takeoff, something goes wrong. It's one of the worst accidents in American aviation history. Initially, suspicion falls on Airbus's revolutionary construction methods. Large parts of the aircraft are made from a new material known as carbon fiber composite.
Composite materials are a bit of the wave of the future. Strong, and as importantly, they're lightweight. And in the airplane business, weight equals money.
Had there been a massive failure in this revolutionary new construction material?
Alarm bells were set off. We worried a lot about the rest of the Airbus fleet, whether or not there were inherent weaknesses in other Airbuses.
If Airbus are building aircraft with flawed components, could hundreds more drop out of the sky?
So we spent a lot of time studying, testing the strength of these components and how good the design was.
They use an ultrasound scanner to test the material for hidden hairline cracks or weaknesses.
Unlike metal, the fractures and stresses can't be seen by the naked eye.
They re-examine the design. They examine other Airbuses. They can find nothing that explains why the tail should shear off.
turned out to be pretty much of a red herring. The design was stronger than it was certified to be.
But if it isn't a structural fault, why has the plane's tail fallen off? In a hunt for other clues, Benson's team recreate the aircraft's last minutes. Their attention soon focuses on the aircraft's first officer, 34-year-old Sten Molin. The son of an airline pilot, Molin has been flying for 10 years, all of it with American Airlines.
American 587 Heavy, Kennedy ground, runway 31 left for departure. Taxi left on Bravo, full short of Juliet.
That day, as flight AA587 prepares to take off, Molin is at the controls.
Left Bravo, short Juliet, American 587 Heavy.
Just in front of him is a Japanese Airlines flight. As the Japanese flight climbs, its engines generate powerful vortexes of wind. They are known as wake vortexes.
Wake vortexes are very powerful miniature tornadoes that are created as an aircraft flies through the sky. One comes off each wingtip.
These vortexes can cause serious air turbulence.
If, for instance, a very small aircraft were following very closely behind a very large aircraft, the smaller aircraft can experience structural damage.
So the planes following need to keep their distance. Air traffic controllers know this. Every pilot is expected to know it because that's a lot of upset in the air.
American 587 Heavy, 13009, runway 31 left, clear for takeoff.
3031 left, American 587 Heavy.
But could such a common phenomenon as wake turbulence really have upset Flight 587?
587 Heavy, fall.
At the National Transportation Safety Board, Benson's team continue the search for answers. They examine the aircraft's battered flight data recorder for evidence. They turn the numeric data into an illustration of what happened. Gradually, they piece together Flight 587's final minutes, and it's all about pilot error. The cockpit voice recorder picks up the captain's voice.
A little wake turbulence, yeah?
Molin replies.
Yeah.
Then, to stabilize the plane, he'd stamped on the rudder controls. It's the standard procedure for stabilizing an aircraft in these circumstances. The flight data recorder shows Molin had been particularly energetic. First, he'd forced the rudder sharply to the right, then to the left.
He operated them so aggressively that the rudder went to stop. In other words, as far right and as far left as it could go. 4 times in 7.5 seconds. Back and forth, bang, 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 bang.
The rapid movement creates huge stresses on the aircraft's structure. Eventually, they become just too great.
The first officer put loads on the vertical stabilizer that were twice the design loads that the thing was certified to take, and it ultimately failed.
The attaching points fracture. The tail shears off, and the plane smashes to earth. But how can a pilot break an aircraft by simply manipulating the rudder controls? It now emerges that Airbus has issued specific warnings against violently reversing the rudder. But American Airlines has never warned its pilots that this could lead to structural failure. Indeed, Their training encourages pilots to use the rudder energetically. The conclusion is horribly clear. Over 250 people have died because of pilot error. Molin had simply not been properly trained to fly an Airbus. But for many lay observers, there is another question. Why, at a very busy airport like JFK, where wake turbulence is a routine problem, was a junior officer with a reputation for overreacting in charge of the takeoff? It's a story that goes back, ironically, to an earlier attempt to reduce pilot error. London, Heathrow, 1972. Pilots that year, at what was then called British European Airways, are in the middle of a bitter and divisive pay dispute. Junior pilots are planning a strike. But many of the airline's older pilots are vehemently opposed to the idea. One of them is Captain Stanley Key, 4 years off retirement and anxious not to rock the boat. That afternoon, Key has a furious row with a younger, militant pilot.
Stanley Key's attitude was that strikes were a dereliction of duty. You had a duty to do, and one thing you did not do is fail in your duty, and your duty was to turn up to work, come what may.
Several hours after the row, Key is rostered on a routine flight to Brussels. With him, on BEA Flight 548, are co-pilot Jeremy Keeley and second officer Simon Ticehurst. As the aircraft climbs out of Heathrow, Key, at the controls, is said to be still fuming from the row. Suddenly, things go wrong. 2.5 minutes into the flight, the aircraft goes into a stall. It passes low over the densely populated town of Staines on the outskirts of London. Seconds later, it smashes into the ground. Almost immediately, sightseers clog the area. All 118 people on board are killed. It's Britain's worst ever air disaster. Within hours, air crash investigators arrive. As they pick through the rubble, they find something very puzzling.
The flight recorder we took away last night rather suggests that something went wrong with the leading edge droop around about 1,800 feet.
Droops are flaps on the front of a jet's wings that extend to provide vital extra lift at low speeds. A Trident must reach 3,000 feet and be flying at 225 knots before the droops can be safely retracted. But the flight data recorder shows that BEA Flight 548 was only flying at 1,800 feet at a speed of 162 knots when the droops were withdrawn. It's much too soon. The plane will have gone into an immediate stall. This was the first error, but it should not have been fatal. Chris Woods is a former Trident pilot and trainer.
The first thing that happens is a warning. It shakes the control column and basically saying to the captain, you are flying too slowly, push the stick forward, which will lower the nose of the aircraft and gather speed.
If the pilot still doesn't respond, a second emergency procedure kicks in.
A ram will push the stick all the way forward and hold it there until the speed has been recovered.
The plane will dive, the speed will pick up, and the stall should be averted. Yet the flight data recorder shows that somebody has overridden these alarms. What had caused Stanley Key, an immensely experienced pilot, to make such a basic error? And why had neither of his crew stopped him? The investigators look at several possibilities. A post-mortem shows Key suffered heart problems. Could the violent row just before takeoff have triggered a sudden stroke? Comes from a piece of the aircraft's debris. It's the cockpit table of one of the junior pilots. It's covered in anti-Key graffiti. One reads, "Key must go. Where? Down the drain." Another suggests, when Stanley Key dies, who will be God's next rep at BEA? Is this a clue to the real problem? Could the row over strike action have made Key's relationship with his young crew so bitter they simply weren't talking to each other?
In the hierarchical setup in that cockpit, challenging the captain was much more difficult than it is now.
We will never know if this is the truth. But the inquiry report is a trigger for important changes designed to reduce future pilot errors. From now on, it's the junior officer who flies the aircraft, particularly if conditions are difficult. This leaves the senior officer, the captain, free to watch for trouble and, if necessary, demand a new course of action. It's a safety routine that in the following years is widely adopted by airlines across the world. And it's why, nearly 30 years later, when American Airlines Flight 587 takes off from New York, nobody questions the fact that Sten Molin, the junior officer, is at the controls. By the early 2000s, the lessons of accidents like Kegworth and Queen's have finally been driven home. But in the airline industry, there's also another, even more important development designed to eliminate pilot error: automation. The leader in the field is the European aircraft manufacturer Airbus. In the mid-1990s, Airbus launches the new A330 series. It's one of the first aircraft to make extensive use of the new digital technologies. It's so clever, it can almost fly itself. Martin Alder is an Airbus pilot.
To have a simple input control stick rather than control column, just like your games computer.
This stick is like a mouse on a computer and takes instructions from the pilot. But the aircraft's autopilot also receives data from a mass of other inputs scattered through the plane.
Computers take information about the speed, the altitude, and central gravity of the airplane, and they add or subtract from the pilot's input to make sure the output that goes to the control surface on the wingtip is exactly what's required to do the job.
It means the controls are always trimmed to provide maximum efficiency. Flying becomes much less reliant on a pilot's skills. Even more importantly, the software will override the pilot if he makes a mistake.
The airplane won't let them do anything that might cause the airplane to crash.
Apart from takeoff, which still can't be fully automated, there is almost nothing a pilot need do except gaze at the ultra-modern liquid crystal displays. Pilot error is all but eliminated. Flying becomes much safer. Or does it? Qantas Flight 72 is travelling from Singapore to Perth. The plane has just made 3 dramatic changes of course, without the pilots doing a thing. First, it's climbed. Then, it's dived. Many of the 300 passengers are in real trouble.
People were thrown around. They were thrown at the ceiling and then thrown at the floor. Computers were thrown around. Baggage, that flies around. A lot of people got severely injured.
Several have broken bones. Many others have been seriously battered and bruised. The pilots now frantically wrestle to seize back control. But for hours, they've been gazing at the screens and nothing's happening. It's lulled them into a false sense of security. It now takes valuable minutes to grasp what's going on.
When you have a failure, there is obviously a startle factor. We are human. And then we have to start taking in the information we've got and then decide from that what the appropriate response is.
If you wind up with an electronic glitch or a computer glitch in an automated cockpit, this is what pilots often say. What's the plane doing now?
What's the plane doing? What's the plane doing?
And that expression to me is so important because it really explains that there's sort of a disconnect between the plane and the person flying the plane. This process can cause a pilot to lose very precious time.
Finally, the pilots realize the aircraft's fabled computer control system is malfunctioning and switch it off. "40 minutes later, the plane makes an emergency landing in Western Australia. Everybody has survived. But it's been a close call. A later investigation reaches an unexpected and ironic conclusion. It's the very system designed to reduce pilot error that's caused the problem. The plane is equipped with sensors that automatically monitor the angle of flight. These appear to have sent corrupt data to computers controlling the autopilot. First, they tell the autopilot the plane is descending steeply. In fact, it's flying normally. The autopilot, thinking the aircraft is descending too rapidly, orders an ascent.
The computers were told that the aircraft's attitude was varying, and it wasn't. But they were trying to correct this.
Seconds later, the sensors change their mind and tell the autopilot to descend.
So the computers themselves weren't actually wrong. The sensors were.
The pilots have been left with no option but to turn off the autopilot. But how can a system designed to eliminate pilot error go so badly wrong? It's a question that will become increasingly pressing in the wake of a terrible accident in another part of the world. Rio de Janeiro. Air France Flight 447 takes off on a scheduled flight to Paris. The plane is carrying the latest automated technology designed to reduce pilot error. But then, 3.5 hours later, over the Atlantic, it vanishes off the radar. Waiting families in Paris are distraught. Several days later, some of the wreckage is found floating in the sea.
The aeroplane hits the surface of the sea, everybody dies. So once we were up there, 30,000 feet plus, and then we're in the drink. So what happened?
Despite a huge search of the crash area, the flight data recorders are not found. It means investigators can only guess at what may have happened. But once again, suspicion falls on the aircraft's automated flying system. Just before the crash, onboard computers automatically relayed data to an Air France ground station. This shows speed sensors on the front of the plane were giving conflicting readings about the speed of the aircraft. It would have immediately puzzled the pilots. It's now, experts believe, they committed a cardinal error. They became so concerned about the problem, they lost sight of what the aircraft was really doing.
I think this has got a lot to do with the fact that this was at 2 o'clock in the morning. The pilots were fixated on solving the problem. What's going on here? What's making these two indicators tell me lies? And in the meanwhile, the airplane starts descending. The pilots simply had lost their appreciation of what the airplane was doing. They must have done.
While the search for the remains of the aircraft continues, we'll never be sure if this is what happened. But once again, vital components in the automated flying system seem to have failed. This distracted the pilots, who forgot to fly the plane. The Qantas and Air France incidents have opened a new controversy. Could it be that the new and clever systems designed to reduce pilot error are in fact causing errors themselves?
Whenever you introduce clever machinery to get over a known problem, you are introducing a new problem. All you really can do is to make absolutely certain that you are making things better than they used to be.
Today, modern cockpits are better equipped and designed to assist the pilot than ever before. Training is more regular and rigorous. Pilot error should be on the wane. Flying has never been safer. But the irony is that in trying to eliminate pilot error, we've introduced a whole new series of unexpected problems.